Africa, a continent rich in natural resources and cultural heritage, paradoxically remains home to over 400 million people living in extreme poverty. A startling contradiction that raises urgent questions about its underlying causes. We have all at one point or another questioned why there is so much poverty in Africa despite the continent being incredibly rich. But why is this so? Who is really to blame for this worrying reality? And what is the way forward? Join us in today's video as we unpack everything there is to know about poverty in Africa. By the time we are done, you will know exactly who to hold responsible for Africa's poor economic outcomes and what can be done to change this situation. To better understand why Africa is so poor now, we must take a little trip down memory lane for some important historical context. Indeed, Africa's current struggle with poverty has deep historical roots, beginning with centuries of exploitation during the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forcibly removed, stripping the continent of its most valuable resource, its people, while devastating its social structures. This era set the stage for further exploitation during the colonial period, when European powers, through the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, partitioned Africa without regard for its cultural or ethnic boundaries. Colonizers focused on extracting resources such as gold, diamonds, and agricultural products, leaving behind little in terms of infrastructure or systems to sustain local economies. This extractive model fostered dependency and prevented the development of diversified industries. Following independence in the mid-20th century, the continent faced neo-colonialism, with global powers maintaining control through economic and political influence. This historical backdrop has perpetuated systemic poverty, creating an economic landscape where Africa's vast resources benefit external powers far more than its own people, sowing seeds of inequality that persist today. With history now out of the way, let us now turn our attention to some harsh realities on the ground today regarding the poverty situation in Africa. Today, Africa is paradoxically one of the richest continents in terms of natural resources and one of the poorest in terms of human development, with some statistics so shocking that they sound almost unbelievable. For instance, did you know that over 400 million Africans live on less than $1.90 a day? Tragically, nearly half of all children in Africa are caught in this vicious cycle, facing a future of limited opportunities. Malnutrition is another major challenge, with 1 in 5 people in the region being undernourished. This contributes to the millions of children suffering from stunting and wasting, conditions that hinder their physical and cognitive development. Access to basic needs like clean water and sanitation is also alarmingly low, with over 400 million people lacking safe drinking water and over 600 million without basic sanitation facilities. The implications of these deficiencies are dire, as they fuel the spread of preventable diseases, leading to millions of child deaths each year. The education crisis compounds these hardships, as millions of African children are out of school. Even those fortunate enough to attend often receive poor quality education, which limits their prospects and reinforces the cycle of poverty. This education gap further diminishes the region's potential for long-term development. Together, these statistics paint a grim picture of the reality many Africans face daily, trapped in a cycle of poverty, poor health, and limited access to education. Addressing these interconnected crises is essential for breaking the cycle of poverty and achieving sustainable development across the continent. So who do we blame for all of this mess? It would be easy and preferable to point our accusing fingers at one culprit so we can deal with it appropriately. But you must understand that the responsibility for Africa's persistent poverty is shared among multiple actors, both internal and external, who have contributed to systemic inequality and underdevelopment. For starters, colonial powers bear significant blame for establishing exploitative systems during their rule. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 arbitrarily divided Africa, prioritizing resource extraction over local development. Post-independence, these powers maintained influence through neo-colonial mechanisms, ensuring African economies remain dependent on exporting raw materials while importing finished goods. Global institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank have also played a role in perpetuating poverty. In the 1980s and 1990s, these organizations imposed structural adjustment programs on African nations, which required austerity measures, cuts in public spending on essential services like health and education, and the opening of markets to foreign exploitation. The result was an increase in inequality and further dependence on foreign aid and loans, preventing African countries from developing the infrastructure needed to grow sustainably. Multinational corporations, in turn, exacerbated this inequality by extracting Africa's vast natural resources while failing to reinvest adequately in local communities, perpetuating cycles of poverty and inequality. Developed nations are also complicit through unfair trade practices, exploitative contracts, and perpetuating aid dependency. Together, these factors form a web of culpability, leaving millions of Africans trapped in poverty and calling for systemic reform. But while external actors played a significant role, the responsibility for Africa's poverty cannot be solely placed on foreign powers or institutions. Local governments also share a substantial portion of the blame. Corruption, poor governance, and the prioritization of elite interests over the welfare of the general population have been major contributors to the continent's economic stagnation. In resource-rich nations, for instance, vast amounts of wealth are concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority of the population continues to live in abject poverty. This brings us to our biggest culprits if we are playing the blame game concerning who is responsible for Africa's entrenched poverty. Yes, we said earlier that one factor cannot be solely blamed, but the reality is some factors are more responsible than others. And in the context of Africa's poverty, look no further than our leaders to identify the biggest culprits. The reality is that, despite the historical and external challenges, many African states could have been wealthier and more prosperous if managed by competent and honest leaders who weren't obsessed with enriching themselves at the expense of the populace. For instance, remember the late Nigerian dictator Sani Abacha. He alone siphoned $2 to $5 billion from national coffers, and his family allegedly hid most of the loot abroad in Switzerland, as well as in other jurisdictions including Liechtenstein, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Abacha's family and associates were implicated in a massive corruption scandal, and many years after his death, Abacha's loot is still being repatriated to Nigeria in bits and pieces. Beyond Abacha, other African leaders have also been embroiled in corruption scandals. In Equatorial Guinea, the Obiang family, who have held power for decades, have been accused of embezzling billions of dollars from the oil-rich nation. In South Africa, former President Jacob Zuma faced allegations of corruption and state capture involving questionable deals with businesses and government officials. These are just a few examples of the many instances where African leaders have abused their power to enrich themselves, leaving their countries impoverished and their citizens suffering. This theft, greed, and selfishness by African leaders to enrich themselves at the expense of their people is largely responsible for poverty on the continent. Several influential figures have acknowledged this problem of leadership. For instance, former Nigerian President General Olusegun Aremu Obasanjo, while attending the 15th African Youth and Governance Convergence in Ghana last year, acknowledged that poor leadership and governance are at the heart of Africa's challenges. Africa's problems are enormous, but I will start from Nigeria, my country. We are not in a state of war, nor are we in a state of peace, but politically, economically, and socially, we are not stable. This cuts across the whole African continent, and we are in bad shape and situation because leadership and governance in our different countries and subregions have not lived up to expectations. Some are blaming the colonial power slave trade or neocolonialism, but that is not the case. We have put colonialism behind us for well over 150 years. And so what excuse do we have to blame colonialism or look for a scapegoat? Leadership and governments have simply not lived up to expectation, General Olusegun Obasanjo said in his speech. Similarly, Mr. Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General and Ghanaian diplomat, highlighted the lack of political will amongst leaders and poor governance as the central issue. In his foreword to the Africa Progress Report 2010, Annan noted that the responsibility for driving equitable growth and achieving the Millennium Development Goals rested firmly on the shoulders of Africa's leaders. Their inability to manage resources effectively, invest in infrastructure, and prioritize their citizens' well-being has been a significant barrier to prosperity. So, what is the way forward in addressing this issue? Addressing poverty in Africa requires a multifaceted approach that tackles systemic issues, empowers local communities, and ensures equitable participation in the global economy. First, African nations and leaders must prioritize governance reforms to curb corruption, ensure accountability, and promote transparency. Strengthening institutions and the rule of law will enable fair distribution of resources and foster trust between governments and citizens. Additionally, diversifying economies is essential to reduce reliance on raw material exports. Investing in value-added industries, technology, and agriculture can create sustainable jobs, boost local economies, and shield nations from global market fluctuations. On the global stage, international institutions and developed nations must reassess their relationships with Africa. Trade policies need to be restructured to ensure fair access for African exports, while debt relief initiatives can free up resources for social investments. Multinational corporations must adopt fair practices, reinvesting in local communities through infrastructure, education, and healthcare projects. Aid programs should shift from dependency models to capacity-building efforts, emphasizing skills development and innovation to empower Africans to lead their own development. Education and healthcare systems must also be significantly improved to break the poverty cycle. Governments and NGOs should collaborate to provide universal access to quality education, vocational training, and robust healthcare infrastructure. Addressing gender inequality by empowering women economically and socially can also drive widespread benefits. Furthermore, regional cooperation among African nations, supported by frameworks like the African Continental Free Trade Area, can enhance trade, foster innovation, and build resilience. A united, transparent, and empowered Africa holds the key to breaking free from poverty's grip. Finally, we must elect better leaders who prioritize the welfare of their people over personal or elite interests. Strong, accountable leadership is essential to implementing effective policies that foster economic growth, ensure equitable distribution of resources, and combat corruption. By empowering leaders with a genuine commitment to public service, Africa can unlock its full potential and achieve lasting prosperity. In conclusion, Africa's poverty is not an inevitability but the result of systemic barriers rooted in historical exploitation, economic inequities, governance challenges, bad leadership, and social disparities. The responsibility for dismantling these structures lies with multiple stakeholders. African governments and leaders must prioritize transparency and inclusive policies, while global powers, international institutions, and corporations must reform exploitative practices and support fair economic participation. Regional cooperation is vital for building resilience and fostering growth, but lasting change requires a unified effort that empowers Africa's people to reclaim control over their resources and destinies. By addressing the root causes of poverty through collaboration and sustainable development, Africa's vast potential can be unlocked, transforming it into a continent of opportunity and prosperity. With its rich natural resources, youthful population, and resilient spirit, Africa is poised to become a global powerhouse if systemic injustices are dismantled and equitable frameworks are established. Your perspective matters. Do you think poverty will one day be a thing of the past in Africa? Share your thoughts and insights in the comments section below. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to the New Africa channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our informative future videos. Stay informed, stay engaged, and thank you for watching.